This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, I'm speechless. Everything is going on in Washington and nothing is good.
Your sighs get deeper every time you ask the question, Danny.
I know it. It's really true.
Well, today, what the hell is going on is we're talking about the filibuster. So President Trump is pushing Republicans to get rid of the filibuster. He was doing it in the context of the government shutdown, but that seems to have resolved itself without blowing up the filibuster, but he still wants it. He wants it because he wants to get his agenda through, and the Democrats are basically not going to cooperate with anything. They're going to stymie him at every point, and he's getting frustrated, justifiably so frustrated. But the solution, I think, is a terrible one. We had Marty Gold on our podcast a couple of years ago when the Democrats were in power and were thinking about getting rid of the filibuster, and were stopped from doing it only by Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who blocked them. And now they're pretty happy that they didn't. That they should be thanking Sinema and Manchin because they're using the filibuster against Trump. And it's just one of these things that I don't get in Washington. The unbelievable short-sightedness on both sides. I mean, right. You know.
Well, so I will say this, Mark. I think, and I said this, I think on last week's podcast as well. I think with the off-year election, not midterm, but with the off-year election and the Democratic sort of romp through Virginia and New York City and New Jersey, et cetera, that Donald Trump has basically preliminarily entered into his lame duck status. In other words, he really just doesn't see things past 2028. And so his agenda is what matters to him, right? He's never been a guy who thinks about posterity or what are the history books going to say. He wants action. He wants it now. And so he doesn't really care about the implications for the nation, which is what you and I are going to talk about today. And of course, the answer is what Ron Johnson said. Ron Johnson, don't always agree with him, but senator from Wisconsin, he said, let's not be schmucks, okay? and he's right, because of course, as you correctly say, this is one of those things where what goes around comes around, and it is going to come around with vengeance.
Yeah. So I did a column on this, but I just want to briefly
give us the highlights.
Give you the highlights of what would happen if the Republicans got rid of the filibuster and the Democrats came back into power. And I think actually three things would happen. The first thing they would do is they would make structural changes to our government that would be irreversible and that would lock Republicans out of power, possibly permanently. So they would pack the Senate. How do you do that? You add the District of Columbia as a state, which is 2 guaranteed Democrat seats. You add Puerto Rico, which leans Democratic, would probably be a couple more Democratic seats. And there's even just saw the other day in the paper that Guam wants to become a state, and I looked to see what
the People's Republic of China would have a vote in the Senate.
There you go. But if Guam were to become a Democratic majority there as well, so you could have anywhere from 3 to 6 safe Democratic seats added. And if you know anything about Senate elections, the Senate doesn't swing that widely anymore. So I think that would make it almost impossible for Republicans to ever take back the Senate. Then they would do the same thing in the House. They would add seats to the House, and blue states are more populous than red states, and so therefore they would gain more seats than the Republican red states would, which would expand their congressional majority, and they would use gerrymandering to make sure that those seats were all Democratic seats to the extent that they could in the blue states. That, in turn, would help them pack the Electoral College, because the Electoral College, outside of the seats that are given to the votes in the Electoral College that come from the Senate, the votes that come from the House membership depend on the makeup of the House. And so, therefore, if you add more Democratic seats to the House, you add more Democratic electors, which would make it much harder for Republicans to win back the presidency, and it would stop what's about to happen after the 2030 census, which is a big shift of electoral votes and congressional seats from blue states to red states. So they would lock in their power. And then the other thing that they would do to lock in their power is they would pass the federal electoral takeover that they were trying to get through under Biden, but were stopped by Sinema and Manchin from passing.
Thank
right?
God for
And so
Sinema
that
and
means
Manchin.
they would repeal they would make same-day registration. They would repeal state voter ID laws. They would everything that conservatives have been complaining about would be in terms of election changes that are favoring the Democrats and making our elections less possible reform. That would all happen. So all of that would make it impossible for the Republicans, or at least very hard for Republicans to take back power and certainly gain back unified control of government again. Then second thing they do, repeal everything that Trump and the Republicans enacted when they had the filibuster-free Senate. Because everything we do, tax cuts, regulatory rollbacks, all the rest of that, that's easy to repeal because there's no cost to it, right? And then they would pass every socialist policy that they dreamed of. Medicare for all, Green New Deal. You go down the list of all the crazy stuff that we've been filibustering. We were filibustering and they never brought up because it couldn't survive a filibuster during the Biden years. All would become enacted into law. And so the problem with that is even if if Republicans manage to take back power, government's a one-way ratchet. We still haven't repealed Obamacare, and we promised to do that. Once they create an entitlement, it never gets taken back. And so it would be a massive, catastrophic change to our country. And if we got back in power, we would never change it because you can't and they would pack the Supreme Court too. I forgot that, which would allow them to do all sorts of unconstitutional things because they would have activist judges who would hold it up. So once a Supreme Court justice is on the court, they serve for life unless they're impeached for misconduct. They don't get taken off. There's never been a state that got statehood and had it taken away. All these structural changes would be permanent. All the spending would be permanent, and the country would basically be remade in the image of Mondami and would become a one-party democratic dictatorship. And I say that, and it's not hyperbole. That's literally what would happen. We would become a one-party state and a socialist one at that. That's what would happen if we did this.
Right. Well, now
Tell me I'm wrong.
I do. But so, for the Democrats that are listening to this, of course, they're thinking, sure, wow. That could be okay.
Sounds like a great idea.
And all I can say to that is, except that when the Republicans come back, every single possible law that could be reversed would be reversed. And so we would end up, and this is what I say in our interview as well, we would end up like a banana republic. One of the things that a lot of decision makers don't like in business about the Trump administration is simply the capriciousness, right? It is, 50% tariffs, 10% tariffs, 12% tariffs, and they don't know what's coming the next day. It's very hard to make investments. It's very hard to hire people. It's very hard to buy stuff if you don't know what the cost of it is going to be tomorrow. And that uncertainty would extend to every element of life. Why would you run for office if the odds are you're going to lose? Because now you can have mail-in voting, internet voting, non-citizens voting, everybody with a driver's license voting, Al-Qaeda getting their mail-in ballots over in Pakistan. This is what it would look like. And so our economy would suffer enormously from these radical back and forth swings. And, obviously, what's the answer to that? Well, the answer will be, we'll try and elect people who make pledges not to engage in these sorts of swings. But they won't get elected, because why would you if you support your agenda being passed? It also means this endless process of vetoing, where Congress will pass stuff, they'll send it to the president, he'll either support it or he'll veto it. But, it basically means that everything that you know about this country and how it is governed is no longer sacrosanct. And to me, I don't care whether it's Republicans or Democrats, to me, this is a recipe for tyranny and civilizational collapse.
I don't think you exaggerate. I don't think that's hyperbole. I mean, this is one with so many of our guardrails have been erased or eroded in recent years. This is like the last guardrail that keeps our country centrist and sane. And
Right.
if you
And just to
and if we
underscore
lose
to
it,
people, Mark, let me just sort of take a second, because one of the things we didn't do is really dive into how this works, right? If you care about something, and you worked in the Senate, and I did too, if you care about something and you want it to happen and it's important to you, you must have members of the other party with you, because otherwise it's not going to pass. What does that mean? It means that you go and you check with your Democratic or your Republican counterpart. It means you make an effort to get your boss into agreement with somebody else's boss. It means compromise. You know, what you and I so often talk about, it means not being 100%er. It means being an 80%er, taking the W where you can get it by working with other people. And the end of that in government, we've already seen the end of this in civil society, right? You know, where people send you death threats because you're a conservative and believe in Trump. People send me hate mail because I'm a Jew. You know, we've seen the end of comedy in public life. We will see the end of comedy in politics and governance. And the implication of that is so dramatic, I don't think people can begin to grasp it.
well, the counter to everything you've said is that we've already seen the death of comedy in politics. They indicted Trump 91 times. He faced 2 assassination attempts. They impeached him twice. For better or for worse, the efforts to destroy him. And the fact is, the Democrats basically said that they're not going to cooperate on anything with Donald Trump. And so that whole idea of let's reach across the aisle and work with each other to pass
Like
things
Fetterman,
is
right.
gone. Yeah, except for a handful of people like Fetterman, right? And so, that's gone. And what Trump would say is, look, they're going to do it anyway. So why don't we go first and get a lot of good stuff done? That's the argument back.
Right. And
I don't know,
the answer is because we are responsible stewards of governance, because as Ron Johnson said, we should not be schmucks. And because we care, what does conservative mean? It means that you seek to conserve that which is good, that which is traditional.
That's
that
not
which
necessarily what
works.
it means anymore.
But it oughta.
Yeah, it oughta. I agree. But
It oughta. Damn it.
to the post-liberal right, which is gaining traction, and that's a whole nother topic for us to take on at some point. They don't care about any of those things,
Right.
And you just seize power and ram through your stuff and save the country because it's going down the toilet.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yes. All right, let's get our guest on. I don't know whether folks will remember. We have talked to him, as Mark said before, but he is a treasure.
The world-renowned expert on this topic. The man who literally wrote the book on the filibuster.
He literally did. Marty Gold, Martin B. Gold is his grown-up name, is a partner with Capital Counsel, LLC. He has more than 50 years of experience in all of this. He's an authority on congressional rules, parliamentary strategy, and he advises and has been advising for decades senators and their staff, both sides of the aisle. He serves on the adjunct faculty at GW at George Washington. He's authored several publications, including The Legislative Filibuster, Essential to the United States Senate, as well as Senate Procedure and Practice. And I underscore this to you. These both sound like sort of these dry tomes. Let me just say, this is cool stuff.
Yeah, Marty is absolutely, he knows Senate procedure inside and out, and he knows the history, and he's going to break it all down for you for something complicated that many of us don't understand, the filibuster. He's got the goods. Here he is. Marty, welcome back to the pod.
Glad to be here, friends.
Well, it's so great to have you back. We're having you back because the filibuster is rearing its ugly head again. And you've explained on this pod a couple of years ago why getting rid of the filibuster would be a disaster, but that was under the Democrats. And now the President of the United States is calling on Republicans to get rid of it. And it's equally a bad idea, whether Republicans or Democrats do it. Can you first, before we get into the reasons why, can you just explain people what the filibuster is and the history behind it? Because I think, people say, well, it's not in the Constitution, so, what's wrong with getting rid of it? Like, where does this whole process come from?
Well, let me say this. It's not in the Constitution. That's 100% true. What's also 100% true is that no rule of the Congress is in the Constitution. What the framers of the Constitution did was to give the House and the Senate the right to make their own rules, and in other words, the right to self-govern. And how the House and the Senate chose to do that was up to the people who were elected to those chambers. So over a period of several centuries, the Senate has evolved in a way that has rules that basically give effect to the two great rights of senators, the right to debate and the right to amend. Because unlike the House, which has evolved into a majoritarian institution, in the Senate, individual senators have enormous rights, minorities have enormous rights, again in service of the basic principle of the right to debate and the right to amend, and I would argue in service of the Constitution, which created the Senate as a check on the House of Representatives, a place where legislation or other considerations could be slowed down and given greater deliberation. There are examples after examples after examples of things that whisked through the House of Representatives that took substantial time in the Senate because of those rules, and I would argue, therefore, that the Constitution is served by those rules. In any event, the Senate has at no time had a procedure that would allow for simple majority cloture on legislation, that would allow for a motion for the previous question as it is interpreted today in the House of Representatives to act like a legislative guillotine and to cut off debate. It has always been a place of very deliberate proceedings. Some would say unfettered debate. It's not completely true, but largely unfettered debate. And a rule that has been in effect since 1917, which is the cloture rule, that says that debate can be brought to a close, but only if a supermajority of senators decides to proceed in that way. And if a supermajority of senators does not decide to proceed in that way, then debate is, on most questions, is open and unlimited.
Marty, I want to get to what's wrong with the current debate, but just as a historical matter, part of the problem that Mark has written about, that you've written about, that I've written about, that pretty much everybody who opposes the end of the filibuster has written about is that once it's gone, it's going to be very hard to get back. But presumably there was a moment when there was no filibuster and it was put in place. Can you give us a little bit of that
Sure.
history and the years?
Well, absolutely. So the first Senate met in 1789. And in 1789, filibustering was not a tactic that was used in the Senate to delay legislation. There may have been some debates that were a bit longer than others, but it was not a tactic that was used in the Senate, and it was not used in the Senate for about a half century until you get to basically 1841. In 1841, the Whigs were in charge of the Senate, precursor to the Republican Party, and their opponents were the Jacksonian Democrats. And the issue at hand was an effort by the Whigs to recreate the Second Bank of the United States as a way of funding capital improvements in the United States, something that Andrew Jackson, who was no longer in office, had vigorously opposed when he was president. And the effort by the Whigs to recreate that Bank of the United States and to fund it was opposed by the Jacksonian Democrats that remained in the Senate. They filibustered it, and ultimately legislation wound up passing and then got vetoed by President Tyler, who was himself a Jacksonian Democrat, and that was the end of it. But it showed the viability of a tactic that could be used to delay or to derail legislation that certain senators might disagree with and weren't willing to allow to come to a vote for a protracted period of time. So you could argue that the first major filibuster that occurred in the Senate, not the first time somebody talked for a long while, but the first major filibuster that occurred in the Senate started in 1841 with the Second Bank of the United States, and then it continued through the 19th century. Not all the time, but on various questions that would come up that would be controversial. And there became increasing demands to try to control the filibuster. If you couldn't control it by attrition, which was just wearing down the people who were doing the filibuster, then you would control it by a rule. But every time they tried to come up with a rule that would bring some control to it, the rule itself was filibustered. And so it turned on itself through the rest of the 19th century into the 20th century. No effective means of shutting down a filibuster, which particularly going toward the end of a session when the calendar is crowded and there's not a lot of time to do things, would be fatal to many items. Finally, that changed in 1917. America was trying to stay out of the First World War, not to get into the First World War. President Wilson had run for re-election in 1916 on a platform of he kept us out of war. But the Germans made it very hard for us to stay out of that war. They had a policy earlier in the war of unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. The United States protested it. The Germans stood back away from it. But then, trying to break a stalemate in the war, they revived it. And so they began to sink American shipping at record rates in an effort to starve out the British and to cause the British to surrender. To stay out of the war, Wilson proposed legislation to arm American merchant ships. And he did this at the end of the 64th Congress, which was going to expire March the 4th, 1917. It went through the House of Representatives. He had spoken to a joint session of Congress. It went through the House of Representatives, being the House of Representatives, lickety split, and it came to the Senate with a few days to spare. Enough time to pass the bill, except that he ran into the buzzsaw of the Willful 11. The Willful 11 were isolationists who thought this was a ticket into the war, and they didn't want America getting into the war. They didn't want Wilson to have that authority. So people like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin and George Norris of Nebraska led this filibuster that essentially ran out the clock on the 64th Congress. And at high noon on the 4th of March, 1917, the gavel came down and the Congress was over and the bill had not passed. Wilson made a public statement denouncing the Senate and talking about the little group of willful men who served no interest other than their own, and said reform was needed in the Senate rules. As it happened, there was a special session of the Senate that was called to begin on March 5th. The purpose of the special session was not to deal with the rules. Its purpose was to confirm nominees for Wilson's second administration. But once the Senate was meeting, they could do what they pleased. And what they pleased was to cope with filibustering. So, special committee was formed, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, to work out an agreement of some kind. Some people wanted majority cloture, some people wanted no cloture. And the agreement that they came to was for a vote of 2/3 of senators voting to end debate on pending legislation. And that was the rule that they put in on March the 8th, 1917, first time that they ever had an ability to vote to end extended debate in the Senate. It was not frequently used. It was considered an outlier. So by the time, for example, that they had invoked cloture on the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the rule had been in effect for 47 years, and it was only the 6th time that they had ever invoked cloture. 47 years, and the first time on a piece of civil rights legislation. Obviously, the use of cloture has tremendously expanded since that time. But my point in bringing out that number is just to say that even when the Senate did it in the first place, for the reason that I outlined, they did not then just resort to invoking cloture on this, that, and the next thing. It was an act of last resort, not an act of first resort. What the Senate wanted to do through the career of many senators who served in the early 20th and to the middle of the 20th century, was to be a place of unlimited debate where the real restraint was not the vote to invoke cloture. The real restraint was self-restraint against just filibustering ad infinitum. So again, things have changed, but that was at least the purpose of the original rule.
So how did
and
they
the
get?
origin.
How do they get from 2/3 of the Senate to 60 votes?
So it was
Which is the
2/3
current
of
standard.
senators voting in 1917. In 1949, they expanded the rule to apply to motions to proceed and to nominations. But when they expanded the rule, they also raised the threshold. So they went from 2/3 of senators voting to 2/3 of all senators. Then, at the dawn of the civil rights era in the 50s, liberals, we can say liberals from both parties, said this is too complex. This is too complex. We have to change the rules because otherwise we can never pass civil rights legislation. So they agitated and eventually won a rules change that brought it back to 2/3 of senators voting in 1959. The civil rights legislation passed under those rules, but then other legislation was going to be filibustered. I mean, this did not have to do solely with civil rights. Many, many subjects were the topic of filibusters. And so by 1975, there was further agitation for a liberalization of the rule. And in that year, they took it down from 2/3 of senators voting to 3/5 of all senators, which is where it has stood to the present day, over a half century now. It's really a half century since they did that. What has changed, of course, is that the use of the 60-vote threshold, which was back in 1975 only imposed when cloture was invoked, now is used all the time, where minorities, for example, will say, all right, here's how we'll cooperate with you. We won't make you run a cloture process on this piece of legislation, but we're going to say, you want that amendment to pass, it's going to need 60 votes. You want that bill to pass, it's going to need 60 votes. And we'll build a 60-vote threshold into a unanimous consent agreement. So we'll facilitate the movement of the legislation, but we'll also say that the legislation will not pass unless it has a significant measure of bipartisan support, because it'll have to come over the 60-vote threshold. So that kind of tactic wasn't really used in 1975. It is extraordinarily common today.
So it was the Jacksonians who invoked the first major filibuster, right?
Right.
And now we have a Jacksonian president who wants to get rid of it. So what's changed with the Jacksonians?
An insufficient knowledge of the true meaning of Andrew Jackson. The truth is, the people's attitudes about the filibuster often have depended on who it is that's doing the filibustering. I mean, Senator Schumer tried to kill the legislative filibuster in 2022. Kill it, okay? If he had been successful in 2022, he wouldn't have been able to filibuster the legislation ending the government shutdown, okay? Because they would have been stuck with his result, and the Republicans would have just pushed forward the clean CR, and they could have done nothing about it. So the person that tried to end the filibuster in 2022 lived by the filibuster in 2025. And that is, you can say, well, how hypocritical of him, except for the fact that it has worked for both parties exactly that way. I mean, there were Republicans when the Democrats began to filibuster George W. Bush judicial appointments, who wanted to end their ability to do it, and the Democrats' ability to do it by exercising the nuclear option. Senator Bill Frist, who was the majority leader of the Senate, was under great pressure to do that, and his effort to move in that direction was vigorously denounced by the Democrats, including Tom Daschle and Harry Reid and Joe Biden and others. Then, in 2013, when Obama was the president and the Republicans were filibustering his judicial appointments, it was Harry Reid that executed the nuclear option. So the playbook and the script could simply have been exchanged between the two parties. In other words, nobody is in this in a pure state, although the consequences, once you act, in 2005, when Frist almost acted, the nuclear option was derailed by a bipartisan agreement called the Gang of 14 Agreement. 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats said, let's take a step back from this. And they did successfully take a step back. In 2013, there was no taking a step back. So Reid got what he wanted in terms of confirming Obama judges, but because he got what he wanted, you have today the Trump cabinet. If you look at all of the people in the Trump cabinet that the Democrats disapprove of, are we talking about Pete Hegseth? Are we talking about Pam Bondi? How about Kristi Noem? How about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.? How about Russell Vought? All those people who were confirmed by the Senate could have been stopped by the Democrats unilaterally with no Republican help if Harry Reid had not killed the filibuster on nominations back, other than the Supreme Court, in 2013. And if Harry Reid had refrained in 2013, I believe you would still have the filibuster for the Supreme Court as well.
Right. I always like to remind people that it was Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, and a nasty partisan he was. I remember that every time I hear talk about the airport, the Harry Reid Airport that was named in his honor, and wonder whether he deserved that. But that's exactly right. That is what liberated the president to put in the nominees that he wanted. So let's talk a little bit about the bad things that can happen if the filibuster goes away. One of the things that Mark wrote a really good piece about this in the Post, and we'll put that in our show notes. But I had written a piece before Donald Trump's first election saying what I was worried about as well, which is that if you end up with no filibuster, then it's not simply that government shutdowns can't happen. It is that the rules of the Senate can be changed, the size of the House can be changed, states can be admitted into the Union. All of a sudden, the floodgates open, not necessarily for the things that we think, obstructionism, but for a whole series of wish lists that are on the far left or could theoretically also be on the far right. Talk a little bit about what it is that the Senate could do if there were only a 50-vote margin.
Well, you'll be talking about, Danny, you put your finger on the most important thing, honestly, okay? You're talking about a Senate with no rules, other than those that a sitting majority wishes to obey, okay? That means the majority can do whatever it pleases. There's no impediment to it, right? Because whatever the majority does is the latest exercise in time of the constitutional rulemaking power, and it takes precedence over all the exercises that preceded it and that are inconsistent with it. Okay? So they don't obey the rules and they make it up as they go along. Now, to your point, people have their chamber of horrors. Well, if they do this, they'll pass this kind of legislation. If they do this, they'll pass that kind of legislation. Whatever kind of legislation you hate, and the other side can just go ahead and ram it through, negotiating with itself and just cobbling together a simple majority with no guardrails, by the way. This is not like budget reconciliation, where you at least have bird rule guardrails of what can go into a bill. Here you have no guardrails, none. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is structural changes. For example, the size of the Supreme Court is set by statute. The size of the courts of appeals are set by statute. If you want to, in this litigious society, affect the makeup of the courts, just make the Supreme Court 15 people and have a president with a nuclear option capability appoint people that the minority cannot stop. And if you think, well, the size of the D.C. Circuit should be expanded, the size of the Second Circuit should be, or the Fifth Circuit, or any circuit can be expanded, just write the law and expand that so you pack the courts. Now, add those senators for D.C. and Puerto Rico, because maybe you can therefore buttress your majority in the Senate, to in essence cushion against the possibility that you might lose that majority if you can add 4 senators that way. Then we can talk about the House of Representatives.
Arnie, I heard that Guam is pushing for statehood too, which is also Democratic. So you could actually add 6 senators.
There you go. Well, why not?
Why not?
Why not? And then you can have expansion of the House of Representatives, because that's also set by law, has been since 1929. We're at 435. Well, why don't we make it 600? The New York Times has twice editorialized about expanding the size of the House, which not only affects the House, but has a major effect on the Electoral College. So all you have to do, and I believe that the Democrats were fully prepared to do this if Schumer had been successful in 2022, all you have to do is put in structural changes that reinforce your political majority. You think that gerrymandering is bad? Excessive gerrymandering is bad, right? This is worse. So all of that can be done if the minority doesn't have rights in the Senate. By the way, they don't need to just stop with killing the filibuster. If they kill the filibuster and they want to make the Senate more like the House, put in the previous question motion like they have in the House to cut off amendments and cut off debate, or create a rules committee to operate like the House Rules Committee does, because the only thing that stops that from happening now is that the minority will filibuster the change. But if you take away minority rights, you can get rid of the importance of unanimous consent agreements and a number of other areas where the minority would still have some residual power, because you can take away that residual power by putting in mechanisms like exist in the House. One last thing. There was a Speaker of the House at the end of the 19th century, Tom Reed of Maine, who was more responsible than any other single person for the House operating like it does today. Tom Reed was a majoritarian. He said that the best system of government was for one party to govern and for the other party to watch. And he was a Republican, so he wanted the Republicans to govern and the Democrats to watch. That's what you will get in the Senate. When you start making these changes, taking away minority rights, one party will govern and the other party will watch until the worm turns, and then you'll get the whiplash pushing back in the opposite direction.
So I just wanted to follow up because, and you actually spoke exactly about the follow-up question I was going to ask, which is I think a lot of people don't understand that the Senate is a far more small d democratic body in terms of how it operates. Individual senators have a lot more power. Without the filibuster, that might change. But of course, the House is a dictatorship fundamentally. It is a dictatorship of the party of the Speaker of the House, and with very few exceptions on motions to proceed and things like that, there are very few possibilities for the minority to actually do anything. So what that would in effect mean if this change happened is that you would have a tyranny of the majority in the House and in the Senate, right?
100%. It's 100% true. Look, you could cite many examples of this, many, but I'm just going to give you one, okay? At the beginning of the McConnell leadership in 2015, the Senate, the first major piece of legislation that passed the Senate was legislation to authorize the Keystone XL pipeline. It was to bring in natural gas supply from Canada, right? It had enough votes to get over a filibuster, but not enough votes to withstand a veto. That's what ultimately happened to it, and Obama vetoed it. In any case, it was on the Senate floor from January the 8th, 2015 to January 29th. There was a point where McConnell tried to invoke cloture. The Democrats who supported Keystone Pipeline still opposed cloture. Why? To give their brethren the opportunity to offer more amendments, because the right to debate supported the right to amend. And only after they had agreement on a requisite number of amendments that people felt satisfied with did the votes for cloture materialize and the legislation go forward to passage. So the right to debate supported the right to amend. Okay? Now, they passed it after 3 weeks in the Senate, and it went to the House. The House took it up under a closed rule, meaning no amendments whatsoever. They had 1 hour of general debate, and they passed the Senate bill. And that's the difference between an institution where individuals have rights and an institution which is a dictatorship. Now, in that case, the dictator was Speaker Boehner, okay? But the general point, but any speaker would be in that position. The general point of it is what took the Senate 3 weeks with the substantial exercise of minority rights and a very robust amendment process passed the House in an hour because the minority didn't have any of that. There is no reason to think that senators are different from representatives. They will do what the rules permit them to do, okay? And if the rules of the Senate look like the rules of the House, the Senate will behave like the House. So what restrains the senators and gives rise to bipartisan negotiation or whatever else you want to say is the rules of the institution. That's it, and nothing else.
So Trump's argument in response to all this is basically the Democrats are going to do it anyway when they come into power. So whoever goes first wins. Because if we go first as Republicans, then we will pass all of our great legislation. It'll make us super popular with the American people, and then we'll hold on to the Senate. But if we don't do it and we don't get anything passed, then we'll be feckless and we'll lose control of the House and Senate. And then when the Democrats have unified control of government, they'll do it and they'll pass all their legislation. And so we're stupid. What do you say to that? I know what I say to it, but I'm fascinated too.
In other words, objectively speaking, it's not without some basis. I mean, if you go back to Schumer, well, let me say it to you this way: when they stopped the filibuster on the Supreme Court nominations, which was in April of 2017 with Neil Gorsuch, April 7th, 2017, Susan Collins and Chris Coons circulated a letter on the Senate floor. That letter, signed by 61 senators, 31 Republicans and 30 Democrats, said to both party leaders, do not touch the legislative filibuster. Do not. Okay? Then, when Schumer attempted to touch it, he didn't sign the letter, by the way, but when Schumer attempted to touch it, what happened to most of those Democrats? They voted with him. Other than Manchin and Sinema voting against Schumer would have been able to carry it forward in 2022. So that would give some reason to believe that a future Senate might just follow the leader, and if the leader wants to get rid of the filibuster, they just do it and then try to take advantage of it as they can. You can't necessarily know that, and you can't necessarily predict that. But what you can do is to show that you all have just lived by the filibuster. You have used the filibuster for 15 rounds to make your case about Affordable Health Care Act subsidies. Right? You have used the filibuster for one of its central purposes, which is to delay legislation so you can make a case to the American people. And you hope that that will have some degree of moral suasion so that people will understand that to take the next step and end the ability of any minority to do that would be terribly dangerous. Moreover, you can also say to those same Democrats, if you didn't like the Trump cabinet, you were the ones that disabled yourselves from stopping them. Okay? So that the danger, both on the positive side and on the negative side, the danger of ending the filibuster could not be more obvious. Try to be a statesman and refrain from doing it. The greatest rule in the Senate is the unwritten rule, which is the rule of self-restraint. Exercise the rule of self-restraint. Now, will they do that? They have ample example of why they should, both in the context of the cabinet and in the context of the filibuster that they themselves conducted to highlight an issue that they hope will bring them back to office in 2026. But you can't predict necessarily what the future will hold. What I do know is this: the Republican leadership in the Senate, under tremendous pressure, has acted in a very responsible way in saying that they would not go forward with changing the rules of the Senate, just as they would not go forward with adjourning the Senate and allowing the president to make recess appointments at the beginning of the Congress, just as Senator McConnell, when he was leader in the first Trump presidency, resisted 34 tweets urging him to get rid of the filibuster. Okay? People have taken the longer view. I wouldn't say that it was a guarantee by any means that the Democrats would not, under the circumstances, take the longer view.
So here's another factor that I'd love to get you to weigh in on, because I think ending the filibuster benefits Democrats much more than it does Republicans for two reasons. Because they are willing to make structural changes that we would not, and because their legislation would be permanent and ours would not, right? So if we do what Trump wants and get rid of the filibuster and pass all of the MAGA agenda, And then there's a backlash because people like divided government, to be honest with you, right? And people don't like people ramming through their stuff. So there's going to be a backlash. Democrats take power again at some point with unified control of government. Without the filibuster, they do three things, actually. They make structural changes, as you've outlined, adding 4 to 6 Senate seats, which means we'll never get control of the Senate again. They pack the Supreme Court with justices who will uphold the most unconstitutional things they could possibly do. They pack the House and the Electoral College, which makes it harder for us to take back the House or the presidency, right? And then they ram through their agenda, right? And then they repeal everything that Trump did gets repealed.
Yes.
Because tax cuts are
Yes.
easy to repeal. And then they pass things that are entitlements and giveaways and free stuff that never get repealed. Because the fact is, once you create an entitlement, government's a one-way ratchet. We still haven't repealed Obamacare. We're fighting over repealing COVID subsidies that were supposed to be temporary. Nothing. So they will lock Republicans out of power, repeal everything we did, and then make permanent changes that will never be repealed even if we manage to get power back. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right. In that respect, I mean, in principle, the Republicans would have a greater incentive to refrain from repealing the filibuster and therefore empowering the Democrats, than the Democrats might have. The Democrats still have things to worry about. What you just talked about is a very good analysis, Mark. I think the Democrats still have things to worry about in terms of the kind of legislation Republicans could pass in matters that they care about, particularly voting rights and the electoral systems and things of that sort. The things that they have resisted for many years, Republicans could just put forward by majority vote. If the Republicans had an unimpeded way of doing it. You will also, by the way, never see another budget reconciliation bill, because who needs to use the reconciliation process with all of the bird rule guardrails and so forth when you have no guardrails and you can just do what you please. But what you will get potentially is whiplash. Right? In other words, the law will not have the degree of permanence that comes from the fact that it was created with bipartisan fingerprints. When it is created with strictly partisan fingerprints, propelled forward by litmus tests, so that who wins in that debate is the most extreme element. If you are really for this abortion rights issue, you'll vote for this kind of legislation. Or if you are really for protecting the sanctity of life, you will vote for that kind of legislation. It'll be the extremes that dictate the litmus tests, and the litmus test will wind up passing, and one party doesn't have to worry about the other party, so that they can just do whatever they please. Therefore, they will adhere to the litmus test, and then when the other party comes in, you get the whiplash effect, moving back and forth. So the stability of the law and federal policy and so forth will also be very much endangered, I would argue.
Right, banana republic stuff.
Absolutely.
Really? Well, that is 100% true. So, okay, Mark and I and you are obviously all like-minded, see the risks, very much fans of the filibuster. Exactly, the slippery banana. And for our listeners without video, Marty just held up a banana peel. But yes, but there's no question that what the filibuster once forced, which was compromise, and I would say with the government shutdown, it also forced compromise, at the end of the day is having a result where there are fewer and fewer compromises, and Congress simply doesn't pass any bills. They wait till the end when, in the moral equivalent of a shotgun wedding, everybody has the, racked and stacked up against either the end of the fiscal year or Christmas vacation or whatever it is, and then they pass an omnibus or a CR, which most members don't even read because it's thousands of pages long, and so we end up having without having the necessary 13 appropriations bills. I can't even remember a year. Even when Mark and I worked in the Senate, we didn't do all of them. Now we do almost none of them in terms of approps, maybe Milcon and a couple of others. So, there are downsides in a time of huge polarization. Bloomberg had an interesting editorial, and they said the filibuster needs to be maintained, but it shouldn't be a tool of abuse. And they made 5 recommendations, and I want to get your take on them. One of them was that senators require that senators hold the floor. In other words, that you can't simply object to a motion to proceed and then go and play video games or whatever it is that senators do these days. You have to actually be on the floor and keep up your continuous debate. Gradually,
like Mr. Smith goes to Washington, right?
Right. Gradually reduce the. I remember when actually somebody did it recently, and I was just bored. But I remember when Alphonse D'Amato did it many years ago. Gradually reduce the cloture threshold across successive votes. Another suggestion: instead of 60 votes to end debate, require 41 votes to extend debate. And limit the procedure only to coalitions that in aggregate represent a majority of the U.S. population, or slash it to 55. I don't know what you think about these ideas. Should we just stick with what we have with the risk that eventually we end up with the nuclear option, D or R, or are these ideas?
Well, Danny, and then there are a few more, like exempting further legislation from the filibuster altogether, such as appropriations bills, right? Or exempting, or the Democrats were going to exempt voting rights legislation. In other words, just basically salami slice this until there's nothing left to it, right? There are also proposals like that. Look, I mean, the one of those that has made the most sense to me, although it's also the one that I think is probably the least impactful in terms of radical change, is making both sides put up the numbers. In other words, right now the only people that need to put up the numbers is the majority that wants to get 60 votes. Because if the vote is 59-0, you have a quorum and you don't get cloture, right? Whereas if you said we're going to do a percentage of the senators voting as opposed to a percentage of the whole Senate, you would be going back to the original construct of the rule, which was a percentage of senators voting. And so therefore, both the people who wanted cloture and the people who wanted to oppose it would have to basically show up and vote. And if one side or the other didn't produce the votes, that would affect the outcome, as opposed to now it's just if the majority doesn't produce the votes, it affects the outcome. So that's a very minor change. Another change could be, cloture is invoked unless the 41 people opposed to it. That's not far off of what I just said, right? In other words, the people who want to stop the legislation have a responsibility to show up and participate. Right? Now you can talk about the talking filibuster, which is something that Senator Merkley has been proposing for a number of years. I've never thought that was such a big deal. I mean, you could right now have a majority leader that kept the Senate in around the clock and said, look, if you guys want a filibuster, we'll be out here and you guys can just go talk about it all night long if you want to go talk about it, which gives the minority the access to C-SPAN and the airwaves and so forth to tell you everything that's bad about the bill. And we'll go around the clock and the minority will be happy to do that, because I don't think that anybody is going to be deterred by that. In other words, people would be, if you force them to filibuster on the theory that if there's a moment gap in time, the chair is going to call a question, right? Which theoretically is the chair's right now, okay? Maybe you get some more people to elucidate on why the matter is being filibustered in the first place. I don't think it's going to make, that much of a difference, honestly. But it might be better for the institution if it looked as though people who had skin in the game were actually out there and participating. I do remember one thing. During the Democrats' filibuster on Bush judicial appointments back in 2003, the Republicans thought it would be a great idea to do something like this, so they scheduled a 40-hour continuous session, rotating time between Republicans and Democrats, 1 hour, 1/2 hour of every hour for one side and the other half hour for the other side. And when it came time for the Republicans to talk about it, they would talk about the importance of these nominations and the quality of the nominees. And when it came time for some of the Democrats to talk about it, well, Mr. President, we're here tonight to talk about the so-and-so nomination, but actually what we should be talking about is minimum wage legislation. And then they would take their time to talk about that. So keeping people on the topic, making sure that the thing is focused and so on and so forth. It's a hard, like as Bill Clinton once said, it's like nailing Jell-O to a wall. But all that having been said, one could make modest reforms to the rules that might move things in the right direction in terms of greater degree of participation and greater degree of debate, so long as one change is not made. And that is to ensure that before you get over the threshold, before you get over the hurdle, you have to have produced a supermajority in favor of it. Okay? That should not change. Even if you said, for example, and I'm not advocating this, but even if you said, it's ridiculous to have a filibuster on the motion to proceed and another filibuster on the merits. So let's get rid of the filibuster on the motion to proceed and make the motion to proceed limited debate. Even if you went that far, it would still be vital to maintain the supermajority threshold on the merits. So there are things that you can do to work around the edges of this, but the core thing is no majority cloture.
So I've got two exit questions, and the first one is this. Have we ever had a situation like we do today where the minority party has basically said that we're not willing to work with the president or the majority on anything, and we're just going to basically filibuster everything they do? And how do you, which is basically where we are with the exception of small, uncontroversial matters, right? How does the filibuster square with an era of such hyperpartisanship where there really is so little, bipartisanship or willingness to cross the aisle and work with the other side? And is it sustainable in that kind of political atmosphere?
Rules of the Senate have to reflect norms, I would judge. Okay? And norms involve self-restraint, and norms involve cooperating where one can cooperate. I mean, if you went back just a few years, for example, okay, to 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, Tim Scott proposed policing reform legislation. The Democrats thought about negotiating about that for a while and then decided they were going to block it. So when the motion to proceed came up in June of 2020, they opposed cloture, and the Tim Scott policing reform legislation died. That was a very typical use of the filibuster, right? Kill something. The filibuster was also used on the CARES Act. The CARES Act was the first piece of coronavirus reform legislation that passed in that Congress. The Republicans, who had control of the Senate at that time, fundamentally wrote the CARES Act without too much Democratic input. When McConnell made the motion to proceed, the Democrats filibustered the motion to proceed, and the motion to proceed did not get cloture. So McConnell moved to reconsider the vote, because surely the Democrats are not going to filibuster the CARES Act when people are hurting as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Democrats filibustered it a second time. So now McConnell files a new cloture motion, but he also opens new negotiations. And when the negotiations finished, they withdrew the cloture motion because there was no need for cloture, and the CARES Act passed 96-0. The reason that the Democrats filibustered the CARES Act was the other reason for the filibuster, to leverage their own legislation into the final work product. Right? There were Democratic priorities they also wanted to see reflected in that work product. When they were, no more filibuster. When they were, it passes 96-0. It was also at a time of high polarization in a presidential election year, but it was also a time when Congress was in essence under pressure to do something. Democrats were willing to use the filibuster to leverage their own priorities into a piece of bipartisan legislation, and then, which in my judgment was a very constructive use of it, right? Then when they got that, matters moved forward. So in highly polarized times, it puts a lot of stress on the filibuster, I think, including calls for getting rid of it because we just can't get anything done, okay? You certainly get less done than you would in less polarized times, that's for sure, okay? But I don't think the situation is so in extremis that it requires you to turn the Senate into a miniature House of Representatives.
And then my final question is this. I've seen Ben Shapiro and some other people suggest that what Republicans ought to do is go to the Democrats and say, okay, here's your choice. We in a bipartisan manner, we enshrine the filibuster in the Constitution so that neither you won't break it when you come back in power and we won't break it while we have it, or we blow it up. It's your choice. What do you think of that kind of ultimatum? And, because there's as you said, it's a real concern that if the Democrats do come back into power, they're going to break it because they almost did it in 2022. Force them to choose which they want, to stop Trump or to use it to stop Trump or use it to get their agenda through when they take power again.
There's a broad absence of trust presently, right? Which goes to the issue of they'll blow it up if they can at the first opportunity they have, right? There's a broad absence of trust, and I'm not tremendously familiar with that proposal, I will confess, but I will say anything that would have it has to be more than an agreement between sitting senators, because other senators will come in. I told you that 61 senators signed the Collins-Coons letter. Okay, today, of the 61 senators, this was only 7 years ago, half of them are already out of the Senate. Right? So, therefore, agreements that bind one set of senators won't bind the next set of senators. You would have to have something more permanent than that. And putting it in the standing rule, yes, and putting it in the standing rules of the Senate is not sufficient, because the standing rules of the Senate can be overridden with the nuclear option. So in essence, you have got to limit the rulemaking power of the Senate. You cannot give the Senate carte blanche rulemaking power and expect that agreements are necessarily going to stay in place. That's because of the ability of a future Senate to use that same carte blanche rulemaking power to make changes. So therefore, you would have to look at a constitutional amendment. And I think that's something that is worth considering.
I think somebody actually introduced a constitutional amendment in the House. I saw this in our notes. Yeah, here it is. H.J. Res. 4, introduced in January of this year, proposing an amendment to the Constitution to provide that debate upon legislation pending before the Senate may not be brought to a close without the concurrence of a minimum of 3/5 of the senators. So it's still in the House Judiciary Committee. There are 4 co-sponsors, 3 Ds: Jared Golden, who's now not running again, Tom Suozzi, Mike Lawler, who's a very liberal Republican, and Adam Gray, Democrat from California. So I bet that goes nowhere, but there is such a thing.
I bet it goes nowhere too. But let me say, but the underlying principle of debating it is a very good one, because it brings out, it addresses a very serious problem, which is in a time of polarization and an absence of trust, the ability for agreements to stick. Even things that are written into the standing rules of the Senate mean nothing if you can use a simple majority precedent to override those rules. Mean nothing, okay? So therefore, you have to look at that. Now, I mean, there are complications to that. For example, are you going to say that therefore we cannot have expedited procedure laws anymore? Expedited procedure laws like budget reconciliation, like the Congressional Review Act, Nuclear Waste Policy Act. You go down, Trade Promotion Authority when that's in effect, right? In all of those cases, you don't need a supermajority vote, because they have used the rulemaking power to put into effect an expedited procedure to allow things to move forward, and there's particularly when there's a time deadline on it, things like that. So the issue is not black and white simple, okay? But the debate is immensely important. And maybe in the course of the debate, these things can be sort of thought through, right? But the idea in essence, that if you looked at the standing rules of the Senate, what you know is, although it only takes a majority to amend the rules, only a majority to amend the rules, majority of senators voting, it takes 2/3 of senators voting to get cloture on a rules change. which means that the majority cannot just ram a rules change down the throat of the minority if what you're doing is amending the rules. So we won't bother to amend the rules. We'll just set a precedent that contradicts the rules, and then we can do what we please. It's that kind of lawlessness that goes back to what I was saying before. You have a body with no rules other than those that a sitting majority is willing to obey. And it presents this kind of political problem that is an immense institutional problem as well. So any of those proposals are worth a look.
Okay, so here's my exit question. I look at this and I often look for analogs. What's another analog that could help to guide us? Because essentially we have the dictatorship of the House and we now have the collapsing process of the Senate. Do other countries and their political systems provide us with any guidelines, any guideposts? Because we don't see these radical swings in parliamentary democracies, for example. Are there any?
I am not aware of very good examples of guardrails here from other countries. First of all, some countries are unicameral, right? Secondly, even in the ones that are bicameral, typically the upper chamber, not just in England, for example, but Germany would be another example of it. The upper chamber does not have coextensive legislative jurisdiction with the lower chamber. Right? The upper chamber is often a chamber of review, certainly not a chamber of initiation, which the Senate is on everything but revenue legislation, right? So you have a situation where you have a bicameral legislature where the upper chamber of that bicameral legislature is the single most powerful upper chamber in the world because it has coextensive legislative jurisdiction with the lower chamber. It can't amend revenue bills, right? And it has unilateral or unicameral authority over nominations and treaties. So that's one thing. Secondly, the representation in the upper chamber, which I think in other countries you might find a greater degree of proportionality in that representation, but not in the U.S. Senate. So that's a distinction. Third, the idea that the U.S. Senate there's constitutional constraints that build in political insulation for the Senate, like the staggered terms, for example. That's another thing that's not common, right? And then on top of it, a set of rules that empower minority in ways that I think that minority is not empowered in other systems. So I think we have something here. It's certainly bicameralism is common, but the role that is played by the U.S. Senate and the way it is played is pretty much sui generis.
All right. Well, let's just hope we keep it decent then. I'm not sanguine, but thank you, Marty. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. It's such an education, and I hope we get lots of people to listen and understand this, especially members.
Well, you
We're
know
often
what?
the slowest learners.
I'm going to end on this note. In the end, they are the custodians, aren't they? They are the guardians, right? The Senate is never better. I don't care what kind of storied history it has and grand traditions it has and all that. It is never better than the people that are serving in it at one given moment, right?
Amen.
And so they are the guardians of it. And if they don't take that very seriously, they're going to leave a wreckage for future generations.
Damn straight.
Amen
You are
to
right.
that.
I'm
Thank
worried
you,
about
Marty.
that. Thank you again. Thank you so much. It's always
Pleasure to
great
be with
talk.
you both.
Take care.
So, Danny, I kind of like this idea of an ultimatum, which is you go to the Democrats, Trump is about to pass something that they desperately don't want to get enacted and say, look, here's your choice. You prove to us that you're not going to do it when you get into power. By
How do they
agreeing,
do that, though?
constitutional amendment. It's a constitutional amendment. Let's write the filibuster into the Constitution. You can make write-in exceptions for some of the expedited procedures that exist, but basically what you do is you take the rules as they exist today and write them into the Constitution in terms of voting margins.
What was the last constitutional amendment we had? And this is not a trick question. I actually don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer either, but it's
I know
very
what-
hard to do. It's
Right.
very hard to do.
Right.
But this would require bipartisan support, right?
Right.
Say we won't do it to you. We've each got a gun to each other's heads,
right? We both think of exactly the same thing. Yes.
Exactly. Yes, we did.
Yeah, we know. Yes.
Thank you, Mel Brooks.
Yeah. Thank you, Mel Brooks. Yes.
Well, we've got guns to our heads, and so, or actually, it's sort of, we don't have guns to each other's heads. We each have guns to our own heads,
Yep.
and we're gonna pull the trigger
Yep.
if you don't agree. So I think that's quite frankly that there's something to that, to force the Democrats to, now that they need the filibuster, now that they're using the filibuster to block. And by the way, the time for acting on that is very short, because if they take back either the House or the Senate or both in the midterm elections coming up, they'll have no incentive to do any of this. They're just then they're just waiting out the last couple of years of the Trump presidency and then waiting to come back into power.
The problem is this is correctly a very extended process that requires two-thirds of the states to ratify any such amendment. And of course, senators cannot force their state governments to do things. So, yes, I agree. We don't have open conversations with the American people about things anymore. The president is one of the best users of the bully pulpit, this President Trump, but I don't see members of Congress. I wish I could just see two members of Congress. I wish I could see Thune and Schumer sit down and argue this out. But of course, Schumer doesn't have the integrity to do that. And it's what really ought to happen is that we put this fight before the American people and explain to them what the consequences are. Because I think this failure, it's only because people don't understand what this is that they countenance its loss. I can't think what our country will be like if it goes away. It's, even if half the terrible things that you outline in that really excellent piece come to pass, that's a disaster.
We will become a Mondami-esque socialist dystopia.
I will say, just as a little asterisk here, that Elisa and I, because she and I do a little show on Thursday afternoons, had an extended discussion about why it is people can't pronounce Mamdani's name. You included, by the way.
What? How did I say it?
You always say Mamdani. It's Mamdani.
How about I just shorten it to Lenin?
I think he's more of a Stalin. Actually.
Okay, there you go.
There you go. You could go with that. And of course, Marx himself was a terrible anti-Semite as well. So, we could have a mix. It could be a mix.
There's so many options.
That commie, as some of our friends have been known to say, but we digress. Anyway, folks, educate yourself. I hope we've contributed to that. But the more you understand about this, the more, and I don't always say this, but the more you understand about this, the more you are going to agree with us.
That's certainly more true for me than you. But anyway.
And with that elegant ending that is certainly in the vein of this podcast, thanks for being with us, folks.
Take care. See you next week.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.